Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a question that I think really haunts a lot of us, especially if you're trying to get ahead, financially or in your career. Where does real success actually come from?
It's that constant search for the external fix, isn't it? The idea that if you could just find the right opportunity or land that one perfect job or, spot the next big thing in the market,
Yeah.
then all of our internal struggles, whether they're financial or personal, they would just sort of evaporate. We're so conditioned to look outside ourselves for the reason we're stuck.
Absolutely. We chase the next shiny object because, let's be honest, it feels a lot easier than trying to change our own internal operating system.
Mm.
But today, we've gone deep into some really uncompromising source material. We've been digging into excerpts from a text called The Discipline of Wealth and Self-Mastery. And its main argument is that whole cycle of looking for external fixes, that is the trap.
That's it, exactly. The author's premise is, it's fiercely simple, but it's also radically challenging. It says that true sustainable wealth, and we're talking about the kind that gives you both financial freedom and, real fulfillment, it's not a result of finding a great opportunity.
Okay, so what is it then?
It's a direct result of building your internal capacity, your discipline, your character. It's all about self-mastery first.
And the material really doesn't pull any punches. So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack this core idea, which is, frankly, a pretty uncomfortable one. The idea that our own stagnation, our own poverty, whether that's in our bank account or our spirit, it's often self-inflicted.
Right. It's a result of these deep habits we have: avoidance, passivity, and the big one, distraction.
So this is not your typical get-rich-quick guide.
Not at all. This material is more like a mirror. It forces you to look at the structural flaws in your own character that are stopping you from seizing the opportunities that are probably already right in front of you. The solutions aren't hacks. They're like total transformations.
So really, we're talking about resilience today. The core idea, as the source makes so clear, is that you can't separate the journey to wealth from the journey of building a resilient self. Let's jump in with the first major failure point the author identifies: the consistency problem. The source material kicks off with this incredibly powerful statement, something like, quitting keeps you poor, not just in money, but in confidence. And what's so fascinating to me is how that immediately challenges this whole modern narrative of, fail fast, pivot. The text basically calls that constant pivoting a form of avoidance.
It does. The author's analysis suggests that most people who are always looking for a new job or a new business idea, they're not really being strategic. They're looking for an escape hatch.
An escape hatch from what?
From the hard part. The moment the work gets difficult or monotonous or just complex, that's when they hit the eject button and start scrawling for the next shiny object.
And that creates this cycle of novelty and failure. They get addicted to that initial rush, right? The beginning of a project when you're learning the basics and it feels like you're making huge progress.
Exactly. You get that quick dopamine hit of, setting up a new website or buying a new course or telling all your friends about your brilliant new idea. But the source points out that only lasts until the real work starts. The execution.
Yeah.
The boring stuff, the dealing with rejection. Most people quit right at that threshold.
And the kicker is they take the same undeveloped person with them to the next thing. The same impatience, the same low tolerance for frustration.
Which just guarantees they never actually reach mastery in anything. Mastery, by its very definition, means you have to endure these long, unglamorous stretches of just grinding it out. If you're always quitting and starting over, you're just constantly resetting your skill clock back to zero. You end up with a little bit of shallow knowledge about a lot of things, but none of the deep, valuable knowledge that the market actually pays for.
The source has this perfect, really relatable analogy for this. The fitness one. I think we all know someone who does this.
Oh, for sure. The person who, starts with a 6-week Orange Theory challenge, they buy all the gear, they're super excited for a bit. Then they decide it's not intense enough, so they quit and jump into CrossFit. Then the weights are too heavy, so they pivot again to yoga, but find it too slow or, too spiritual. A year goes by, they've spent thousands of dollars, and they're no fitter than when they started.
And they blame the programs, right? Orange Theory is too repetitive. CrossFit is a cult. Yoga is boring.
But the author just hammers this point home. The programs aren't the problem. The flaw is the person's lack of consistency. If you show up for 6 weeks, then stop for 3 months, then try something new for a month, you get zero cumulative benefit. Actually, it's worse than that. You get a negative psychological benefit because you're actively training your brain to be a quitter.
And the text links this directly to our professional lives, especially what it calls the idea-chasing mindset. In today's world, you can find a billion business ideas online in 5 minutes, and that actually makes the problem worse.
It really does. It creates this paralysis of choice, and it reinforces this myth that the next idea is the magic one. The source argues that if you're constantly jumping between, say, different e-commerce stores, or you're dabbling in affiliate marketing, or you start a podcast and drop it after 10 episodes, you're just avoiding the deep, hard work of making one of those things actually succeed. You're choosing the thrill of the launch over the monotony of the follow-through.
This brings us to that really vivid metaphor that just perfectly defines this whole concept, the metaphor of the shallow holes. Can you walk us through why that image is so powerful?
It's just the perfect picture of wasted effort. Imagine you're digging for gold. You pick a spot, you start digging, you put in a ton of initial effort, you get the shovels, you clear the ground. But the second you hit a layer of hard rock, the first big technical bug, the first marketing campaign that flops, the first major client that says no, you give up. You move over 10 feet and start a brand new hole.
You've expended all this energy, but you have nothing to show for it.
Exactly. You just end up with a field full of these little useless divots. The source is crystal clear. You never strike gold because you never dig deep enough in one spot. The gold, the wealth, the mastery, it's always buried underneath that first layer of resistance. The person who succeeds isn't necessarily the one who picked the perfect spot to dig. It's the one who decided to just keep hammering away at the rock until they broke through.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second, because this is where it gets tricky. How do you know the difference between quitting too early because you lack grit and quitting strategically because an idea is genuinely a dead end?
That is the million-dollar question. And the source gives us a kind of litmus test, and it's really a character test. It says, most people quit when the work becomes hard or boring. A strategic quit, on the other hand, happens after you've already endured the hard and boring work, you've executed the plan consistently, and the external data, the actual numbers, the market feedback, it's telling you there's a fundamental flaw you can't fix.
So if I've been coding and selling my app for 6 months, and literally no one is buying it, and they all say it's useless, that's data. But if I quit after 2 weeks because learning Python is frustrating,
Yeah.
that's just avoidance.
Precisely. The shallow hole behavior is all about quitting before you have clear data, just to escape that feeling of incompetence or frustration. And this habit is so insidious because it reinforces a really dangerous internal belief that the answer is always out there in the next thing. Every time you do it, you prove to yourself that you can't be trusted to finish what you start. And that just erodes your confidence. Wealth and self-mastery, they require depth.
So if digging deep is the answer, then we have to talk about that big psychological wall that makes most people give up. The author identifies this very specific, predictable moment in any new venture that they call the Valley of Death.
Yeah, this part of the text is incredibly insightful because it maps out that emotional journey we all go on. When you start anything new, a business, training for a marathon, whatever, you're in that initial excitement phase. It's all fueled by novelty and dopamine. Progress feels fast.
You feel like a genius, like you've already won, right?
Yeah.
You buy the domain name, you tell your friends.
And that's where the danger starts, because we mistake that initial burst of enthusiasm for sustainable momentum. That honeymoon phase disappears really fast the moment things stop being fun and start getting genuinely difficult, or even worse, just plain boring.
And the source defines that exact tipping point as the Valley of Death. It's the moment where uninformed optimism turns into informed pessimism.
Let's break those terms down because they're so important. Uninformed optimism is that initial starry-eyed phase. This is a billion-dollar idea. It'll only take a month. Everyone will love it. It's optimism that isn't backed up by the messy reality of actually doing the work.
And then reality hits.
Then reality hits. You find out the market is way more crowded than you thought, or the tech is harder, or just the sheer daily grind of it all is overwhelming.
And that's the switch to informed pessimism. You now know just enough to realize how hard it's really going to be, and your initial estimates seem completely ridiculous. The whole project, and maybe even you, suddenly feel inadequate.
And that feeling, that crushing weight of informed pessimism, that is where most people and most ventures die. They quit, not because the idea is doomed, but because they pivot too soon. They mistake this temporary, totally normal emotional state for a permanent sign that they're on the wrong path. They feel terrible. They assume feeling terrible means they're failing, so they immediately start looking for a new idea that will get them back to that high of uninformed optimism.
So the goal isn't to avoid the Valley of Death, because you can't. It's inevitable. The goal is to build the internal strength to walk through it. So how does the source say we do that?
The author talks about systematically developing what they call the essential muscle, frustration tolerance. And this isn't just some vague idea of being tough, it's a skill. It's the learned ability to keep going through hardship and boredom without needing to feel good about it all the time.
That flies in the face of our whole modern culture of ease and life hacks.
Mm,
If something feels hard, the advice is usually to find a way to make it easier. But the source is saying, no, lean into the difficulty.
absolutely. The author completely rejects the idea that all productive work has to be fun or gamified. Frustration tolerance is like a muscle. It only grows when you willingly and knowingly put it under stress. Think about lifting weights. Your muscles don't get stronger while you're just sitting there. They get stronger recovering from the stress and tearing you put them through in the gym. If you stop the second it starts to burn, you build zero strength.
So that burn, that feeling of this is too hard, that's actually the signal that you're growing.
It's the signal of adaptation. The more you can endure that psychological friction, that little voice saying, I want to quit or I'm not smart enough for this, the more capable you become. And the source points out this is a compounding advantage. The muscle you build getting through a tough project today makes the next even bigger challenge feel more manageable. You've raised your baseline for what hard feels like.
But what are the practical day-to-day mental tools the source suggests for building this tolerance? How do you stop that informed pessimism from just turning into total despair?
It really comes down to two key mental reframes. First, you have to compartmentalize your emotions from your actions. You learn to separate the feeling, I feel overwhelmed and terrible, from the required action, I still have to complete the next 3 items on my to-do list. The action is non-negotiable, the feeling is temporary and ultimately irrelevant.
And the second one?
The second is what the source calls the 1% rule of forward momentum. When you're in the valley, you stop trying to have some huge breakthrough. You just commit to making 1% progress every single day. If the task seems impossible, you break it down into a step that's so small it's almost trivial. Did you write 1 sentence? That's a win. Did you fix 1 tiny bug in the code? That's endurance. It changes the definition of victory from massive success to, I survived and moved forward a little bit today.
It sounds like survival mode, but like an intentional, strategic survival mode.
It is. It's intentional endurance. And this whole process leads to the core insight of this section. The author states, success doesn't come from picking the right opportunity. It comes from building the character needed to make any decent opportunity work.
That's a huge reorientation of focus. Instead of obsessing over which stock to pick, we should be obsessing over our ability to stick with a plan.
Precisely. If you have deep commitment and high frustration tolerance, you can take a kind of mediocre idea and, just through sheer persistence, turn it into a success. But if you have weak character, you get bored easily, you're impatient, you quit at the first sign of trouble, you could be handed the best opportunity in the world on a silver platter, and it would just collapse in your hands. It's not about finding better paths, it's about building better builders. And the Valley of Death is the forge where that builder is made.
That idea of building the builder leads us perfectly into the next big obstacle the source identifies, which is all about external influence. The author calls the need for approval a prison and has this killer quote, "Every time you wait for someone else to say go, you give away control of your life."
Yeah, that just cuts right to the bone, doesn't it? It perfectly captures that loss of personal sovereignty. If your big life decisions have to be approved by your anxious parents or your risk-averse partner or your friends who don't get your ambition, you're essentially giving them a veto over your own life.
And the source argues this need for validation is the #1 thing that stops people from ever even starting. We're just paralyzed by the fear of what people will think. What if I tried this and fail? What will my friends say?
I think for many people, the fear of being judged for the failure is actually greater than the fear of the failure itself. So we optimize our lives for safety and conformity because those are the choices that get us a pat on the back, or at least they don't attract criticism from our social circle. But real, transformative growth almost never comes from conformity. It requires taking unconventional paths that, by definition, are going to make people skeptical.
The source gives this amazing personal story to really hammer home this point about self-approval.
Yeah, the story about moving to California, the author decided to move with almost no money. I think it was just $5,000. And it was a decision that was met with just widespread, vocal disapproval from family and friends. They all thought it was reckless and irresponsible. But the crucial part of the story is that the author realized the decision didn't require their permission. It was an act of personal conviction. And because that commitment was internal, all the external noise just became irrelevant. And that one self-approved decision ended up changing their entire life.
If you wait for everyone to get on board with your big idea, you're waiting for people who have built their lives around stability
Yeah.
to approve of your decision to risk that stability for a shot at something great. It's just never going to happen.
It's a logical impossibility. And to help with this, the source introduces this really brilliant, actionable concept, the future board of directors. It's a way to totally reframe who you're accountable to.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
Tell us how that works. How do you build this board?
You stop asking for permission from the people in your present life who are all trapped by their own fears and limitations. And instead, you start seeking approval from your heroes, your mentors, and most importantly, from your ideal future self. You literally ask the question, would the person I want to be in 10 years, the successful, disciplined version of me, would they approve of this choice? Would my biggest mentor, who's already done what I'm trying to do, tell me to back down or to push forward?
That's genius, because it forces you to adopt the mindset of success, not the mindset of fear.
It completely changes the standard you're measuring against. Your ideal self doesn't care what your mom's neighbor thinks about your side hustle. They care about whether this action aligns with your long-term growth. The source suggests you actually identify like 3 to 5 people, or even just archetypes, who represent what you want to become, and you mentally run your big decisions by them. If your fearful coworker disapproves, but the ghost of Steve Jobs gives you the thumbs up, you know what to do.
And this leads right into the source's big warning about taking advice from fearful people. It says most of us ask for advice from people who have never built what we're trying to build, and that advice is poison.
It's toxic because people who haven't built anything significant will almost always advise you to do nothing risky. They can't help it. They're just projecting their own anxieties and their own limitations onto your dreams. They don't mean to be malicious, but their advice is like a gravitational pullback to mediocrity. The source says advice from fearful people just breeds confusion because it's rooted in caution, not in competence. It creates self-doubt right when you need absolute, unwavering focus.
But how do you tell the difference between fear-based advice and, genuinely wise, prudent caution? If I want to open a coffee shop and my accountant friend says, don't do it, the failure rate is 90%, is that fear or is that just data?
That's where the source says you need to filter everything through action and data. If the accountant just says, don't do it, it's too risky, that's fear. If the accountant says, okay, looking at your business plan, the rent in this location is $10,000 a month. To break even, you'd have to sell 400 cups of coffee a day. Is that realistic? That's data. See the difference? Fear is about the general emotional outcome. Caution is about the specific, verifiable mechanics. You have to filter all the opinions through the lens of data. And the best data comes from actually doing things.
Which is the source's ultimate answer to all this confusion. Clarity comes from action, not from opinions.
Opinions are cheap. The internet is drowning in them, and they just lead to analysis paralysis. Real clarity, knowing for sure what works, what doesn't, and what your next move should be, that is only forged in the fire of action and the feedback you get from it. Stop polling your friends. Start building.
And the author ties this all back to Stoicism, right? The quote from Epictetus. It's not things that disturb us, but our opinions about things.
Yes. The source argues that our lack of sovereignty isn't caused by the criticism we receive. It's caused by our internal decision to give that criticism power. If someone tells you your idea is stupid, that's just sound waves hitting your eardrum. It only has the power to derail you if you let their unexamined opinion become more important than your own conviction. Self-mastery means choosing your own approval over the applause or the boos of the crowd.
We've established that wealth is an internal project. Now let's get into the financial side of this philosophy in Section 4. Betting on yourself. The source drops what it calls a harsh truth here. Most people are in a huge rush to invest externally, in stocks, crypto, real estate, while they've never mastered the basic skill of consistently earning money.
It's a massive misallocation of capital, and it's driven by all the hype you see online. People are trying to multiply a base of capital that is just too small or too unstable because they haven't developed high-value skills first. The author's line on this is so sharp, it's something like, multiplying money is pointless if you don't know how to earn it first. Investing is about scaling. But you can't scale a revenue stream that doesn't reliably exist.
They want to jump straight to passive income before they've even mastered active income.
Exactly. The bottleneck for most people isn't finding the right stock. The bottleneck is the person's own ability to generate surplus cash flow month after month. If you're inconsistent at your job, if you have low frustration tolerance, if you need constant praise to stay motivated, you are not a reliable asset. Why on earth would you bet your limited cash on a volatile external market when your own internal engine is sputtering?
So the source advocates for this really radical redirection of money early in your career, a pivot away from external assets and towards what he calls internal equity.
He lays out his own early strategy. Every single spare dollar he had was funneled back into maximizing his own value. That meant paying for high-level mentorship, specialized coaching programs, learning new technical skills, buying the best tools for his craft, anything that expanded his capacity. He argues that the ROI on those internal investments was infinitely higher than any stock market return he could have gotten at that stage.
But how do you fund that? I mean, for a lot of people listening who are on a tight budget, the idea of paying thousands for a coaching program sounds impossible.
And that's where the discipline comes in. The source is very explicit about this. The funds were redirected from things that other people consider normal or even necessary. Vanity purchases, new clothes, expensive dinners out, the status symbols. That new car payment, the fancy watch. That was all seen as external debt. It was fueling ego, not equity. So that money was ruthlessly channeled into building himself into an appreciating asset.
That is the ultimate form of delayed gratification. You're not just delaying a vacation, you're actively using the money others would spend to look successful, to actually become successful.
It reflects this deep understanding that the highest leverage investment you can ever make is always in yourself. If you have a skill set that makes you $50,000 a year and you spend $10,000 on a course that helps you develop a skill that lets you earn $150,000 the next year, that's a 10x return on your money in 12 months. We're not going to find that in the S&P 500. The author's core message is, you are the asset. Maximize that asset first.
And he drives this point home with a pretty crude but very effective metaphor. You can't put lipstick on a pig.
That phrase is designed to be a bit of a shock to the system, to force you to look inward. It just means that all the external stuff, the fancy office, the impressive job title, the designer suit, it's all meaningless if the core skills, the discipline, and the character aren't there. You can dress up incompetence, but it's still going to produce incompetent results. And the market eventually always pays for substance, not for style.
Let's get a little more specific about the types of internal investments the source really champions. What goes beyond just buying an online course?
The text focuses on things that provide leverage. So high ROI internal investments are things that either compress the time it takes to reach mastery, or they give you access to networks and opportunities you couldn't get otherwise. So that includes, 1, expert access, paying for a mentor not just for their knowledge, but for their accountability and their insight into the specific psychological roadblocks in your field. 2 would be specialized tools, investing in the best software or equipment that gives you a real competitive edge and lets you charge a premium. And 3, and this is an interesting one, health and energy, investing in your physical and mental well-being, fitness, nutrition, sleep, because your energy is the fundamental engine of all wealth creation.
The author makes this incredible claim that even today, after achieving all this external success, his best investment is still himself, not his companies, not his stock portfolio.
And that just speaks to the enduring value of a well-developed character. Markets crash, businesses can fail, but your ability to learn, to adapt, to create value, and to endure hardship, that is a form of capital that can never be taken from you. It's the ultimate insurance policy.
So the crucial takeaway from this whole section is just, it's absolute. Wealth is a direct result of your internal capacity, not your external conditions. You can't separate them.
The focus has to shift completely, away from chasing a better market or a better boss and toward mastering yourself. You have to grow your character before you can grow your capital. Because character is what lets you earn the capital in the first place. Character is what lets you keep it during tough times. And character is what ensures you use it wisely. If you don't have the discipline to stick with one hard project, you definitely don't have the discipline to execute a complex, long-term financial plan. Self-mastery comes before financial mastery. Every single time. So if we bring all of this together, the consistency, the frustration tolerance, the sovereignty, and the internal equity, what the source material is really offering is a unified philosophy of self-reliance. It's a call for radical self-responsibility that is, it's both incredibly demanding, but also ultimately very liberating.
Let's do a quick recap of the 3 core philosophical takeaways that this text is really asking us to absorb.
Okay. First, you need discipline over dopamine. This means abandoning that addiction to novelty, to the constant search for the next easy or exciting thing, and instead you have to learn to embrace the necessary boredom and difficulty that mastery requires. The uncomfortable truth is becoming world class at something is often really boring, but that boredom is where the real skill is forged.
Right. And the second one is personal sovereignty. You have to aggressively take back control of your own life's direction. Real freedom means taking total responsibility for your choices, which means you have to trust your own internal compass, even if that means you have to walk your path alone for a while.
And third, internal equity. You have to recognize that you are your number one financial asset. Your priority has to be growing your character, your skills, and your internal capacity above everything else. Bet on yourself first. The returns from that will compound forever.
And to make sure this isn't all just theory, the source gives us this fantastic final section that lays out 4 direct mindset shifts you need to make. It's like a checklist for how your internal self-talk has to change. This is the actionable part we want you to leave with.
Yeah, let's walk through these. They perfectly highlight the difference between those old self-sabotaging habits and this new resilience-building philosophy.
Okay, the first shift tackles that valley of death, the quitting mindset. You have to move from thinking, this is hard, maybe I should switch, which is just avoidance, to the new mantra, this is hard, that means I'm growing.
That one change is revolutionary. It reframes resistance from being a stop sign to being a signpost. Difficulty is no longer something to avoid. It's confirmation that you're actually pushing your own boundaries.
The second shift is about the idea chasing and those shallow holes. You stop asking, what's the next big opportunity, which is always looking outward. You start asking the mastery question, how do I get deeper and better at my current path?
That question just immediately grounds you. It forces you to commit to becoming indispensable where you are, instead of being a perpetual beginner in a dozen different things.
Third shift. This is the core of sovereignty and that future board of directors idea. You stop asking everyone else, do they approve? And you start asking the only question that really matters, do I approve?
That's the moment you fire your critics and you install your ideal self as the CEO of your life. You commit to your own standards and you refuse to let the fears of other people steer your ship.
And the final shift is all about how you use your resources, about internal equity. You stop saying, I'll invest in myself when I have extra money, and you adopt the strategic mindset. I'll invest in myself so that I have extra money later.
That little change in phrasing just perfectly captures the whole philosophy. You start treating your own development as a mandatory top-line expense, not a luxury. You know that those investments in yourself are the engine that will generate all the future surplus capital you'll need. You're funding your future competence right now.
This deep dive into the discipline of wealth and self-mastery has been, it's been a powerful and frankly pretty uncomfortable reminder that real self-improvement isn't about productivity hacks. It's about character building.
And the final thought from this material, the one we really want you to sit with, is this. The truth is uncomfortable. Your poverty, whether it's in your bank account, your career, or your spirit, is often a self-inflicted wound caused by these deep habits of avoidance, passivity, and distraction. But the good news, the great news, is that because the cause is internal, the remedy is entirely within your control. Commit. Endure the pain of growth. Build your skills with an obsessive focus on depth. Approve of yourself. And stop outsourcing your future to the whims of other people.
So the final question is, which of your shallow holes are you going to stop digging? And which one are you going to commit to digging deeper into starting today? That's the challenge. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today, it really springs from some material that challenges a lot of modern ideas about quick success. It argues that wealth, that mastery, is built primarily through, internal fortitude and character. It places very little value on chasing novelty or external quick fixes.
Right.
So the central question we're wrestling with is this: does sustained success hinge almost entirely on developing that internal character, that persistence? And this is the key, do we have to acknowledge a critical, maybe even co-equal role for external strategic actions? Things like timely opportunity selection and asset investment. My stance is that the internal capacity, your discipline, your resilience, is overwhelmingly the primary driver. External conditions, they're distinctly secondary.
And yeah, that's where I come at it a bit differently. I completely acknowledge that discipline is the indispensable foundation. You can't argue with that. But I believe this intense focus on internal capacity it risks really minimizing the essential strategic choice of path, and crucially, the timing of your external financial moves. We agree internal capacity is necessary, 100%. But I think the analysis has to factor in strategic balance as an equally vital component, a co-equal part of the equation, not just an afterthought.
I see why you'd think that, but let's look at the psychological reality that's presented here. It makes it uncomfortable, but I think a really powerful case that discipline, not the constant chase for a new, shiny strategy, is the true wealth builder. The real enemy here is the habit of avoidance. It's that cycle of quitting and starting over. I mean, when people jump constantly between things, whether it's fitness programs or business models, they never achieve mastery.
This guarantees failure. And it stems from an inability to tolerate what the material calls the valley of death, that psychological slump where your uninformed optimism just collapses into informed pessimism. Success isn't about finding the perfect plan. It's about building frustration tolerance, like a muscle, so you can endure that valley. At the end of the day, the best investment remains investing in yourself, mentorship, coaching, high-value skills, because wealth is fundamentally a result of internal capacity, not just, getting lucky with external conditions.
I appreciate the depth of that argument against the dopamine hit of novelty. I really do. But I have to challenge the fundamental assumption there that success comes from making any opportunity work with an emphasis on better character over finding better paths. That stance, I'm afraid, is a bit of an oversimplification. We often hear the metaphor of digging shallow holes to condemn quitting, but that metaphor holds a pretty dangerous implication that deepening one hole, regardless of where it is, will eventually strike gold.
Well, the commitment is what matters.
Is it, though? What if the dirt, the market, the structural reality of the venture, what if it fundamentally lacks potential? Then pure persistence stops being an act of moral fortitude and becomes, an exercise in catastrophic futility. A strategic pivot, despite the high emotional cost of sunk effort, becomes necessary. And look, while seeking external approval is a self-imposed prison, the text itself hints at a more nuanced view. It suggests we consult a future board of directors. That subtle inclusion shows that some form of externalized strategic insight is necessary for course correction. Action can't be completely insulated from critical strategic thought.
Let's focus on that habit of quitting for a second, which the material calls the absolute enemy of wealth. Quitting, it's not just about reducing your bank account. It leads to a poverty of confidence and competence. The core problem is internal. It's the avoidance of hardship. It's distraction. The mindset shift required is to stop interpreting difficulty as a signal to switch and to start seeing it as a signal of growth. That commitment has to be total.
Okay, I wholeheartedly agree that chronic starting and stopping is destructive, but we need to define our terms carefully here. Is all pivoting necessarily quitting? I mean, when we talk about true resilience, does that not also include the clear-eyed, data-driven decision to exit a mathematically or, structurally unsound endeavor? For example, if you sink time and capital into a project that market data reveals just cannot scale past, say, $50,000 a year because of regulations, staying in that lane simply to prove your persistence, that risks ignoring reality in favor of a misguided moral imperative.
But that's my point. The singular focus on character implies that failure is only due to a lack of moral fortitude, and it ignores the structural realities of the venture itself. Sometimes, the clarity you gain from action demands a strategic exit, not just deeper persistence in the wrong hole. I would push back on that and say that the individual often confuses that structural reality with the valley of death. True commitment requires accepting that most of the resistance you feel is internal. If you're constantly looking for flaws in the path, you're really just looking for an excuse to avoid the hard work of mastery. The ability to distinguish between a flawed venture and your own personal incompetence, that only comes through maximal effort. Until you've exerted that effort, every challenge is just a test of your capacity.
your framework works perfectly if the goal is personal competence, sure, but we are talking about wealth and mastery. And this brings us directly to the tension around the timing and priority of investment. The text, it rightly cautions against rushing into external assets, crypto, stocks, real estate, before you know how to earn. But this emphasis, it risks delaying critical strategic action. And here, the structural reality is economic. Wealth accumulation depends, mathematically, on compounding returns over time. If we wait until our internal capacity is perfected, which, let's be honest, is a moving target, before we strategically invest capital, we lose decades of exponential growth. Just think about this. Delaying serious investment from age 25 to 35, even if your earning capacity is higher at 35, can cost you millions because you sacrifice those early compounding years where time is your greatest asset. So how do we reconcile the mandate to focus exclusively on internal growth with the required mindset shift? Moving from "I'll invest when I have extra money" to "I'll invest so I have extra money later." That mindset shift implies that strategic asset investment has to begin early. It has to run parallel to, not after, internal growth. You have to acknowledge the non-negotiable power of time in finance.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because I think it misses the primary objective. The material is absolutely clear. You can't put lipstick on a pig. External financial enhancements, like a growing portfolio, are meaningless if the inner self is unprepared to generate consistent, high-level income. And why is that? Because the market inevitably shifts. It crashes, bubbles burst. If your wealth relies solely on the external growth of assets and you lack that robust internal capacity, the skill to earn and replace capital, you will be wiped out, and you'll stay wiped out. The primary goal has to be capacity building. That ability to earn is the only thing that sustains wealth through any external condition. The true compounding is in the accretion of skill, which exponentially increases your earning potential in a way that, frankly, often dwarfs early asset returns.
Okay, while skill development is essential for earning, the mathematical costs of delaying asset investment cannot just be ignored because one fears market volatility. You're arguing for competence as a hedge against risk, which I accept, I do. But the truly successful individual does both. They invest deeply in internal equity, and they strategically deploy capital early to take advantage of the structural reality of compounding. To prioritize internal capacity to the exclusion of early asset investment is, I think, a strategic failure. If a person delays investing their first $100,000 by 10 years, they might miss out on having that money triple or quadruple. Character is necessary to earn that $100,000, but time and strategic deployment are necessary for it to become $400,000. It is not an either-or proposition. It has to be a balance.
The balance, however, must be weighted toward capacity. The material emphasizes that if you don't know how to earn it, multiplying it means nothing. People rush into speculative investments not because they're being strategic, but because they are seeking that external shortcut to avoid the internal work. They're chasing the market dopamine hit, not building a sustainable system. Building competence is the structural foundation that supports the roof of the investment portfolio. And without that foundation, the first market storm collapses the whole structure. Let's look at the guidance on action itself, which states that clarity comes from action, not from opinions. This is the ultimate reinforcement of self-sovereignty. You have to move forward driven by self-approval, ignoring fearful friends and widespread disapproval. This kind of bold commitment is what generates life-changing opportunities.
But that's an internal. That emphasis on action leading to clarity is powerful, I agree, but it's inherently risky if you take it as a mandate for blind action. We agree that the individual must develop frustration tolerance to navigate the valley of death, but how do we define the line between productive hardship, the necessary test, and simply being fundamentally wrong about the venture? If we have to ignore fearful people and widespread disapproval, how do we then integrate the strategic wisdom suggested by the future board of directors?
But that's an internal.
That board is essentially an externalized critical perspective. It's asking an idealized mentor what they would do. That strategic vision has to inform your action.
Otherwise, we risk investing immense frustration tolerance into an opportunity that action has clearly revealed to be, well, non-viable. The true challenge is knowing when the data generated by your action dictates a necessary strategic pivot, rather than just doubling down on commitment because failure is seen as a moral weakness.
The distinction there is vital, though. The future board of directors is an internal construct. It's about asking your idealized self for guidance, not seeking permission from external, often fearful voices. It supports self-approval, which is the engine of commitment. The point isn't blind action, it's action driven by commitment. You act, you recognize the feedback from that action, and then you deepen your skills on that chosen path, rather than immediately interpreting hardship as a signal to pivot to the next shiny object. The commitment itself forces the growth that creates internal capacity, and that is always transferable, regardless of whether the opportunity itself fails externally.
But the material itself provides the tension here. If clarity comes from action, that clarity has to include understanding external structural limitations. If my action confirms that the market for my specific skill set is 90% saturated, the most strategic choice, the one my future board would advise, is to pivot the application of that refined skill set to a different market, rather than simply working harder in the saturated one. The successful journey requires both the unwavering character to execute and the strategic wisdom to choose the most leveraged path for that execution.
I still stand by the central tenet here. The source material provides an uncomfortable, but I think a necessary truth, that poverty is often self-inflicted by habits of avoidance and passivity. The remedy is fundamentally internal. You commit, you endure, and you stop outsourcing your future to external assets or paths. The fundamental principle remains: internal equity must precede external capital, because your internal equity is the only asset that can never be taken away from you.
Look, we agree that discipline, character, and resilience are the absolute non-negotiable foundations for wealth and mastery. We're not debating that. However, our discussion, I think it clarifies a profound tension. The successful journey demands not just persistence, but also the strategic clarity to know when and how to integrate external factors, whether that means making timely strategic investment decisions to capture compounding returns, or applying the insight you've gained from action to make a calculated, necessary pivot.
I think the value of this exchange, then, lies in appreciating that interplay. The interplay between building that deep, resilient internal capacity and executing effective strategy. These are aspects which require a continuous effort to align and to balance. So thank you for challenging the limits of the capacity argument.